All right, Torah portion Pinchas. Here's the basic outline. The story of Pinchas or Phineas is kind of broken in two. The beginning of it is at the end of last week's Torah portion, then you're left hanging until you get to this Torah portion to find out what is the result. And it's like when they put the commercial break right when the tension is at the highest. You know, oh, what's going to happen? We're going to break for a commercial right now. And that's exactly what our Torah portion did between last week and this week. So we're going to see whether Pinchas or Phineas gets punished for what he did or gets rewarded for what he did. And then in chapter 26, there's a new census. Chapter 1, there was a census. Chapter 26, there's another census. These two censuses are almost 40 years apart. And it's interesting to see the changes. They're divine changes in the numbers. Chapter 27, a few details. The daughters of Zelophehad come before Moses, and their father is dead. And as Moses talks about the inheritance, they say, well, how about us? Our father's gone. We don't have any brothers. We're not married. Do we get a portion? Do we get an inheritance in our father's name? So Moses didn't know. He had to go before God to find out, what do I do about these 5 sisters? And then God shows Moses the land. He's not allowed to enter the land, but he does get a preview of it. And then Joshua is appointed his successor. And then in chapters 28 and 29, we go through the Moedim, the appointed times, the holy days. But this time, it brings out details about what the sacrifices are that go with each of the Moedim. So that is the basic outline of this Torah portion. I'm always glad when we get to Phineas, because finally, after all the trials and all the failures, they're now done. They're over. You get to Phineas, and it's almost like when he drove that spear through that sinning couple in the tabernacle. It's like suddenly all the tests now are over. At least all the failures are over. It's done. And the people who came out of Egypt are now finally ready to enter the land of Canaan. The wilderness has finally completed its work in that generation. And this is the keystone, this is the capstone, or the whatever you want to call it, the exclamation mark where God says, okay, now you're ready to go in. So this is a very, very important passage, a very important story. So what we're going to do is begin, actually not at the beginning of this Torah portion, but we're going to go back earlier in chapter 25. So Numbers chapter 25. And as you know, Balaam counseled Balak, King Balak, to send some of the best-looking Midianite and Moabite women in among the Israeli camp to seduce the men, and it worked like a charm. It was a horrible thing, but it was very successful if you're looking at it from Balak's point of view. And it says in verse 6, behold, a man of the children of Israel came and brought a Midianite woman near to his brothers in the sight of Moses and in the sight of the entire assembly of the children of Israel, and they were weeping at the entrance of the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting. Phineas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron. So Aaron is Phineas' grandfather. Phineas is a priest. Of Aaron the Cohen, he saw, he stood up from amid the assembly, he took a spear in his hand. He followed the Israelite man into the tent. This man didn't just go into the courtyard, but went in to the tabernacle itself. Only priests are allowed to go in here, and this man is no priest. And he takes this Midianite woman with him to do what you can imagine them doing inside God's tabernacle. You may think it was bad when Nadab and Abihu brought alien fire into the tabernacle and God sent fire out to kill them. But this is much worse than that. He followed the Israelite man into the tent and pierced them both, the Israelite man and the woman, into her stomach. He rammed the spear right through them, through both of them, and killed them. And the plague was halted from the children of Israel. Those who died in the plague were 24,000. And then the Torah portion ends there. Then you're wondering, did he do the right thing? Did he do the wrong thing? They hadn't had a trial. There was no permission to kill somebody in the tabernacle. This man he killed was an Israeli leader. Well, we turn the page and we find out. Verse 10. Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the Cohen, turned back my wrath from upon the children of Israel, when he zealously avenged me. Now, in Hebrew, the word for zealously and the word for avenged are basically the same word. The root word is kana, and in Hebrew, it sounds like this. Bikano et kinati. He kanoed my kana. So in English, the two words are not alike, but in Hebrew, they're very much alike. He zealously zealed my zeal or avenged my vengeance. How do you translate it? I'm glad I'm not a translator. But he kana'd my kana among them, so I did not consume the children of Israel in my kana, in my vengeance, in my zeal. Therefore say, behold, I give him my covenant of peace, my Brit Shalom. And it shall be for him and his offspring after him a covenant of eternal priesthood, because he took kana for his God, and he atoned for the children of Israel. The name of the slain Israelite man who was slain with the Midianites was Zimri, son of Salu, leader of a father's house of the Simeonites, tribe of Simeon. And the name of the slain Midianite woman was Cosbi, which means my lie, daughter of Zur, who is head of the peoples of a father's house in Midian. So, this zeal of Phinehas, until you turn the page and read what happens, you're not quite sure if what he did was wrong or right, whether he's going to get called out by God or rewarded by God. Because so many times in the Bible, when you see an act of zeal, it's the wrong act. In fact, most of the times in my life, I've done something with real zeal. It was not the right thing. And I sent out the email this week and asked, how do you tell the difference? How do you know if an act of zeal is pleasing to God or not? Because there's a lot of zealousness out there. And most of it is very fleshly and not very pleasing to the Lord. And if you go through the scriptures, you'll see a lot of zealous acts. Again, Avihu and Nadav, a lot of zeal, not much wisdom. It cost them their lives. How can an act of zeal truly be for God? We talked about this last night with guests at Erev Shabbat, and it's an interesting discussion. But there's only one thing I can come up with. When Phinehas did what he did, there was nothing about Phinehas in it. It was all about God. It wasn't about Phinehas being angry. It's because this is breaking God's heart. It has to stop. It wasn't because Phinehas was upset and mad. It's because they're desecrating the holy tabernacle. It was all about God and his holiness and who he is. There was nothing of Phinehas involved in this act. He picked up the spear, and what he did was entirely and utterly for him and not for Phinehas. But the moment you do the same thing Phinehas did is because you're mad, because you're angry, because you're upset, because you want to take some vengeance, then I don't think it would have turned out the same. There's a story, I shared it last night with the guest, and I wasn't sure whether to share it this morning for the sake of time, but this is the story. It's a true story. It took place in Europe in a Jewish community 100 years ago or more. And there's a Jewish man who loaned a sizable amount of money to another man in the Jewish community. And they came to terms about when it would be paid back. And it was supposed to be paid back like a year later to the day. They signed or not signed a contract, but shook hands on it. So the year came and went. No payment. So he goes to the man and says, I loaned you this money and you agreed you'd pay it back in a year, but nothing's come in. And the person he loaned the money to says, you never loaned me any money. I don't owe you anything. So the man got so angry, he took him before the Beit Din, the house of judgment. In Jewish communities around the world, the Orthodox communities, you have a panel of judges, of holy, righteous, wise men, rabbis, older men. So he took this man before the judges, and they questioned him. He says, this man never loaned me any money. I don't owe him anything. And so the only thing they could do is to have him hold the Torah scroll and take an oath that he had not borrowed money from this other man. So he's holding the Torah scroll, the holiest object we have, and he held it and he made an oath, I did not borrow any money from this man who's accusing me. Now, the other man, of course, is hopping mad. And he kept saying, you did this holding the Torah scroll, you're desecrating the Torah scroll, you hold this holy object and you lie. Well, then some time passed, and the man traveled to another town, doing some business. He had some time to kill, so he visited the Beit Din of this other town, just to watch what was going on in the court. And there was a similar sort of a trial there, where somebody had claimed that this man owed me some money, and he never paid it back, and they had the guy hold the Torah scroll and make an oath. And he says, I never borrowed any money. Well, when the man who loaned the money came back to his hometown, he stood up before the synagogue, before everybody there, and asked their forgiveness. He says, when I loaned this man money all that time ago, and he didn't pay it back and claimed he hadn't borrowed any, and I took him before the Beit Din, I was so angry that he could lie while holding the Torah scroll. He says, but when I visited this other town, a man there held the Torah scroll and also lied, and it didn't bother me a bit. And I realize now it wasn't because of the holiness of the Torah, because he was desecrating God's name. It's because I lost my money. In other words, his zeal was not for God. Although he said, you held a Torah scroll and lied, his zeal was not for the holiness of the Torah. His zeal was not for any of that except that I lost my money. And so many times, our so-called zeal for God is really just using God as a way to express my anger and frustration, or to take some vengeance on somebody I don't like. We need to be very, very careful with our so-called righteous anger and with any kind of zeal, whether it's an angry kind of zeal or a very exuberant, happy kind of zeal. I remember one church, I was somewhat reprimanded, at least challenged, because during the praise and worship time, I wasn't all happy clappy and doing all the kumbaya stuff, and I would they'd say, no, if you want to stand, you can stand. If you want to sit, you want to sit. So I sat. And so I was kind of challenged on that. And the gentleman said, why is it we can go to a football game and go so excited and clap and cheer at a football game, but when we're praising God, you can't clap and cheer? Well, I said, well, first of all, I'm not so sure we should be doing that at a football game either. We should maintain some dignity, like they do at a what do they play over in England when they play cricket? They don't cheer. They'll do a little of this. That's about it. And I said, well, the most happiest day of my life, the most thrilling day of my life, was the day I stood up at the front of the church and I saw my bride come through the doors and walk down the aisle to become my wife. But I wasn't jumping up and down, doing somersaults and cheering and screaming and yelling. It was the happiest I've ever been. I said, I think we need to maintain dignity, and we could have zeal, but we don't have to lose self-control. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not against clapping and dancing and do all that. That's fine. But we need to be careful, even in our exuberance, Our exuberance isn't out of the flesh, but it's all for him. Because sometimes we can be like David, who danced when the ark came into town, and it didn't turn out well. And I always hear David defended for what he did, but the scriptures don't necessarily defend him. And we just need to be very careful, because when emotions run high, self-control can get away from us. We need to always be self-controlled. Enjoy your emotions, but keep them under control. And always act out of wisdom, and act out of what is right in God's eyes, and not because it just feels right. Is that clear? And Phineas is our model for that. Now, as we go through here, remember again, the man he killed, what tribe was he from? Simeon. Now, go back to the original Simeon in Genesis. Who was his brother? Well, he had 11 brothers, but who was the brother he was most connected to? Levi. Remember on Jacob's deathbed, he prophesied over his sons, and he said, Levi and Simeon are brothers, do not enter into their conspiracy. And he talks about how their anger is a horrible thing. He says, I will scatter them in Israel. And sure enough, they were. They did not receive an inheritance in Israel. Simeon was scattered into the towns of the area of Judah. And Levi got cities, 48 cities throughout Israel and also on the east side of the Jordan. But they didn't get a chunk of land that was theirs. And because what did they do? When their sister Dinah was taken advantage of by Shechem, they went in at night and they slaughtered the whole town and rescued their daughter, their sister. It wasn't right. A lot of zeal, a lot of death and blood. And it was an embarrassment to Jacob. It was an embarrassment to God. It was a blot on the testimony of the children of Israel. But at the time of the golden calf, and we've gone over this before several times, when the golden calf tragedy occurred, Levi did not participate. Simeon did, but Levi did not. And because they did not, Moses rewarded them with priesthood. And so the priests were all from the tribe of Levi. So Simeon and Levi both had a bloodthirstiness, but Levi channeled it so that they became those who brought the sacrifices. But Simeon didn't quite rein his bloodthirstiness in and his anger. Now, we have this rebellion here, and that Phineas put down when he killed the sinning couple. But just back up a few chapters, and what was the last big rebellion they had? It was whose rebellion? Korah. What tribe was Korah from? Levi. I think what we're supposed to do is take this rebellion led by Simeon. We'll just make him the leader of it, because when he died, the rebellion stopped and the plague stopped, and compare it to Korah's, because though there are some similarities, there are some vast differences. I think there's a lot we can learn from them. So let's do some comparisons. So we have Levi on the right. That took place back in chapter 16, Korah's rebellion. And then on the left we have Simeon. And this we'll call Zimri's rebellion, because that was the name of the leader from Simeon who Phineas killed. Why did Korah rebel? Was that out of lust? Was it out of sexual desire? No, he's wanted to be a leader like Aaron and Moses. You take too much on yourselves, he said. You need to share the authority, share the leadership here with us. So it wasn't a fleshly, physical kind of a lust. You might call it a religious lust. He wanted authority with Moses and Aaron. But Zimri's was purely a physical lust. And what happened to Korah? The earth opened up and just swallowed him up, and his 250 followers, just there they went. What happened to Zimri? He was pinned to the earth by Phineas' spear. And now, who made the earth open up? God or some man? God did. This is very important. God took the vengeance against Korah into his own hands. But with Zimri, God didn't. He sent a plague into the camp. As long as Zimri was allowed to continue with his sin, the plague continued to run wild. But Phinehas is the one who is the key to bringing it to an end. And God blessed him. There's an important lesson here. Because when it comes to challenges to leadership, whether it comes challenges to my leadership or the elders or anybody, it makes no difference. When there's a real challenge, a rebellion among some person against spiritual authority, the way you deal with it is you leave it in God's hands. Because the moment I start defending my authority, what does that accomplish? Because my attitude is, God, the moment you want to take this from me and give it to someone else, thank you. And bless that person, whoever that is going to be. God bless them. But I hold it like this. God placed it here, and I don't hold it like in a fist. It's like this. So, Father, when it's time to pass that to someone else, I'm not going to stand in the way. And if I'm doing it wrong, it's time for me to step down, that's fine. So if there's a challenge to spiritual authority, it's not mine to defend or take care of. It's in his hands. If he wants to open up the earth, I hope he doesn't, but he deals with that. And over the years, the 20 plus years, 3-4 years that Beth Tikkun has been around, there have been some people come in here who just had wicked hearts, and they just wanted to take over. And in each case, as I was thinking about this in the middle of the night and reviewing some of these cases, in each case, I never had to do a thing. But I watched the person's life begin to fall apart. Their marriages would fall apart. Their kids would fall apart. Their health would fall apart. It's almost like their life kind of dissolved. The order and security of life just kind of dissolved. And it was a frightening thing to me. This is not what I wished for them. But when people are very determined to grasp for authority, then, and if this authority is legitimate, God will step in and he'll take care of things. You don't have to worry about it. But when it comes to kind of rebellion we see in Zimri, which is a very physical and fleshly one, God says, now this is your battle to fight. And we see this in 1 Corinthians, where there was sin in the community. And Paul writes his letter, says, you need to deal with this. Don't allow this to go any further. It's going to destroy the whole community. You need to take care of these people who are doing these things, who are involved in this physical sin. These two rebellions remind me of way back after the people came out of Egypt right at the beginning. Torah portion Beshelach, which is like the third, fourth Torah portion in Exodus. When the people came out of Egypt, they came up to the Red Sea. And so here's the Egyptian cavalry chasing them on one side. Here's the water on the other. And what did God say? Don't be afraid, stand still, behold the Yeshua, the salvation of the Lord. And he parts the sea, the people go across, and God does all the fighting. They don't have to take one sword. I don't even know what kind of weapons they have, but they didn't have to take anything. They just walked across, and God took care of the Egyptians for them. But then when you get to the end of Torah portion Beshelach, Amalek attacks. And God says, okay, now this one's all yours. Moses sits on the mountain with a staff in his hands being held up. But Joshua and the Israelites fought. They had to use their own swords, do their own fighting against Amalek. One war God fights, the other war we fight. And the same thing is true here. And Beshelach took place right at the beginning of the 40 years. This takes place right at the very end of the 40 years as a reminder. But this time, the enemies are not from Egypt. This time, the enemies are not from Amalek. This time, the enemies are from Israel itself. These enemies, Korah and Zimri, arose right up out of the community. And this is one of the things, any of you who ever get into full-time ministry or whatever, at first the attacks will come from the outside, but eventually they start coming from the inside. If the enemy can't bring it from the out, he'll start from the in. Okay? But you can have victory in both cases. But you have to know which enemy God fights and which enemy he leaves it up to you to fight. We need to know what the strategy is for the two kinds of battle. But I'm getting off track. As a result of Korah's rebellion and the earth opening up, Aaron is established as the leader. Aaron is established. Aaron and Moses together. But here, Phinehas is established. God makes this Brit Shalom with him. We're going to look at that in a moment. With the Korah's rebellion, there were 250 that were swallowed up by the earth, but then the rest of the rabble who are kind of following Korah and kind of sympathetic to Korah, there are 14,700 who died. But over here, Simeon, 24,000 died. 24,000. Almost twice as many, not quite. Because I find that this kind of rebellion on the right side, this kind of religious rebellion, is not as common as this physical kind. There are so many kinds of physical attacks that we can bring through addictions, through sex, through finances. There are all kinds of weapons he can use to pull people's hearts away and physical desires to bring destruction to community. Over here, there are always people who are looking for religious power, some kind of authority like that, but it's not as common. It's not as common. But it's there. This reminds me of the enemy's temptation of Eve in the garden. She saw that the tree was good for food. This is a physical desire. But is also desired to make one clever. If your translation says wise, you need to fix it. It's not, the word there is not wise. It's clever, mentally sharp and astute. When you look at Korah's rebellion, if you go back and reread chapter 16, Korah talks, Moses talks, Korah talks some more, and then Dothan and the other guys, they talk, and then Moses talks, and Aaron talks. All these words are flying around. And this is always the way it is when there's a challenge to spiritual authority. It's a war of words. All these words fly around. There's not one word spoken when it comes to the whole Zimri Phinehas thing. It's just all physical lust. What's there to say? It's the Nike motto, just do it, you know? With Korah's rebellion, the question is, who's the right leader? But with Zimri's, who's the right God? Because Korah never challenged that God was God. That Adonai was Adonai. There's no question about that. Or that the Torah was the Torah. He says, Moses, I'm not so sure you're supposed to be doing all you're doing. I think you're supposed to share that around. We need to be elevated to leadership as well. But with Zimri, he completely turned his back on God, threw the Torah away, and he followed the gods of Baal Peor. I mean, how destructive is that? And there are a lot of other interesting contrasts. First of all, the door of the Ohel Moed is mentioned in both, because a lot of these events take place at the door of the tabernacle. Also, when it comes to Korah's rebellion, there's no location mentioned. Remember, everything on the right is kind of a spiritual, religious sort of thing. So there's no location mentioned. But for the left one, this physical battle, it tells them where it took place. It took place at Shittim. And so anyways, I challenge you to go back and take a closer look at those. Now, there's something that really is fascinating that takes place in the Hebrew when we get to this covenant of peace. It's in chapter 25 and verse 12. Therefore say, behold, I give him my Brit Shalom. And right in the middle of the image here, you see the word shalom. This is it, right in the middle. Okay, you see it? Well, I want you to know something interesting. Right here, That letter there is the letter Vav. And if you look closely, it is broken in half. And in that Vav and that word and that verse on every Torah scroll on earth, that Vav is broken in two. And if it isn't, it's not a valid Torah scroll. And it's the only place in the Bible this happens. Only place where a letter is broken in half like this. It has to be that Vav and that word Shalom. Now, what's that all about? There's an entire sermon in that little broken Vav there, and you're about to hear it. But there's a world of meaning in that. Some people say the Vav looks like a spear coming down, and that when the spear went in them, God broke the plague. Well, that's kind of fanciful, might be true, but why did God inspire the ancient the copiers of the Torah to break that Vav? Maybe it was that way when Moses first put it down. I don't know, but it's been like that for thousands of years. The Vav is broken in half. I want to talk about brokenness. I think Phinehas was successful in what he did because he had experienced God's brokenness in his life. How he had experienced it, I don't know. It doesn't tell us. But a truly broken person is always an instrument in God's hands. Moses was a broken person. As you've heard me share before, he spent the first 40 years of his life a prince of Egypt, learning he was a somebody. And then he spent the next 40 years of his life a shepherd in Midian, learning he's a nobody. Then the last 40 he spent learning what God could do with a nobody. But those 40 years in the wilderness, being a shepherd, think about how tortured he was. I was a prince in Egypt. I lived in Pharaoh's house. I was raised in the palace. I could have delivered my people. I killed one Egyptian. I failed. They're still in slavery. Here I am in Nowheresville, watching over sheep, smelly sheep in Midian in the desert. For 40 years, Moses thought what a failure I am. What a failure. What a wasted opportunity. And then finally, when he sees the burning bush, he's 80 years old. He's ready for retirement, right? God calls him. Now you're ready. But Moses didn't want to go. He had it so built in his mind of what a failure he was. God, you're wrong. You can't use me. You can't use me. I'm a washout. You understand? And in God's mind, though, it's like, Moses, you're finally ready to be used. Because you have the education of Egypt, but you're a broken man now. You're a broken man. Now you're ready to be used. And if you watch for this, you'll see it in every character in the Bible that God uses. He uses broken people. Broken people. Those are the kind of people he really can use. Broken ones. He did this with the entire people of Israel over those 40 years. Because the purpose of the wilderness is to break us. And there's no way to get from Egypt to the promised land, spiritually speaking, without going through the wilderness. As Ben mentioned in the prayer service, it's only an 11-day journey. But you can make it a lot longer if you want, like 40 years long. But it's up to you. But you're going to be broken in the wilderness. Because when God, at the beginning of those 40 years, God took the Israelites out of Egypt, but it took him 40 years to get Egypt out of the Israelites. And that old generation died, the new generation grew up. And when you look at the census there in chapter 1, there's a total of 603,550 Israelites. But at the end of the 40 years of the second census, there's 601,730. They lost 1,800 people in total. Well, I mean, they lost hundreds of thousands, but they were replaced with the new children. But there were 1,820 fewer people who went into Canaan than came out of Egypt. That seems like a loss, doesn't it? Except that 1,820 is one of the most unique numbers in the Bible. You never find it just spelled out exactly, but you find it here and there throughout the scriptures. Because you see, the thing about 1,820, it's the number of God's name, 26 times 70. 7 is the number of perfection, completion. 70 is completion on steroids. So God's saying, yeah, there's 1,820 fewer of you. But this is my signature on this. I've reduced you physically, but spiritually, you're greater. God's name is Yud-He-Vav-He. Guess how many times it appears in the Torah? If you guess 1,820, you're right. God's saying this reduction, it's my hand in your life. Yeah, I reduced you physically, but I've built you up spiritually. And at this point, when they come to this census, God is done breaking Israel. They're ready to go in and conquer the land. There's still a couple tests left, but they pass them this time. And if God has reduced you, remember, God reduced you. Maybe he used a broken marriage to destroy your life, to break you. Maybe he used addiction to break you. Maybe he used a great financial loss to break you. Maybe he used failed health to break you. But you got to be broken. You have to be. He can't use anything but broken people. It's ordained right in the chapter 1 of Genesis. And we see it all through the scriptures. God only uses what is broken. Here, let's take some other examples. Let's look at Genesis chapter 1. Oh, by the way, 1,820 other examples of that. If you take the first word of Genesis, Bereshit, Beit, Resh, Aleph, Shin, Yud, Tav, 6 letters. Each of those letters is a word. And if you spell out each letter as a full word, when you add up their numerical values, it's 1,820. The very first word of Genesis has this number encoded into it. And there are other examples I won't bore you with. But God has put his signature, his fingerprints all over this number in the Bible. So when you see this, you know God is present. God's at work. And though you don't see him in the details, when you see this number, you realize he was in control all the time. That is what this number always represents. He's there in control. He's sovereign. You know, back in Genesis 1, and we went over this before, but it's worth repeating. In Genesis 1, God said, let us make man in our image. Now, the word for image is Zelem. That's the word in red here, Zelem. According to our likeness. Now, the word for likeness is the word damut. There it is there, damut, in green. Now, follow what it says. God created man in his own Zelem. In the Zelem of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. What happened to damut? He says, let's create him in these 2 ways, in my Zelem, in my damut. But it says twice he made Adam and Eve in his Zelem, but damut is not mentioned. What's the difference? Zelem is like the physical, the outward. Now, God does not look like a man. We look like him. And he made us symmetrical because God is in balance. He made us with a left and a right because God works in the spiritual and in the physical both. And everything about the human body tells us something about God's workings. But damut has to do with a person's character, with a person's inner soul, with who they are spiritually. And God couldn't just mold a damut out of clay. The Zelem, yes. The Demut, no. Because the character comes through one thing and one thing only. This word Demut is very interesting because when you divide it between the first and second letters, this letter here means door. Dalet, the name of this letter, Dalet, means door. But the word mut, Hebrew students, what does mut mean? Death. The only way you're made into God's likeness is by going through the Dalet of mut, the door of death. Because you see, this is the thing that's inside God's heart. Because in God's heart, God is love, and love is defined by saying no to me and yes to you. Me dying to what I want and coming alive and pour my energies into what you want and what is best for you. And he allowed Adam and Eve to walk through the door of death. They could go through it the easy way or the hard way. So he put this tree in the garden. He said, don't eat of that tree. Then the enemy comes along and says, oh, you want to eat from this tree. God said no, but the enemy says, oh, you want to eat from this. You'll be like God when you do this. So they had a choice. God told them, the day you eat of that, you die. But you see, if they didn't eat of it, they died as well. How does that work? They could either say, no, we're not going to eat from it as much as we want to. We want to eat from this tree, but we're going to die to our own desire. We're going to say no to our own desire and say yes to God's commandment, don't eat. And God said, welcome aboard. Now you're my Demut. You've learned what it means to die to self for the sake of another. But what they did, they ate from the tree. And they began to die. And they experienced brokenness and tragedy and despair and disappointment and failure. And later, around chapter 5, God says, you're in my Demut now. Because they learned what death was. And either way, they had to die. They could have chosen to die to their own desire, but instead they sinned and they died anyway. But everybody has to go through the door of death. We all have to. We all have to learn what it means to die to self. There's an easier way to do it, and there's a hard way to do it. But the wilderness is the way you do that. The wilderness is what God has ordained to teach you how to die to self. And by the time they get to the place where Phinehas runs that spear through Zimri and his girlfriend, they'd learned. And now they're ready to go in and conquer the land. Look at Peter. Lord, I'll die for you. I'll do whatever. No, before the cock crows 3 times, you'll deny me. How do you think Peter felt after he denied his Lord 3 times and he hears the cock crow? Washout. Failure. God can never use me again, I'm sure if Peter felt. I'm done. But then at the resurrection, Yeshua speaks to Miriam there at the tomb. And he says, go tell my disciples and Peter, I'm coming to see him. How about Jonah? God had to create a whale and a worm to break Jonah. And you go all the way through. How about Paul? Paul, he's a somebody. And God just knocks him off his, was it a horse or donkey he was riding, blinds him, and then lets him know that the guy you've been persecuting all this time, it's me, Paul. So I have news for you. From here on out, you're mine. And Paul, for 3 years, went back to Mount Sinai and rethought everything in his life. He was a broken man. But boy, did he change the world. You get the idea? So if you're not a washout, if you're not a loser, if you're not a failure, God doesn't have a whole lot of use for you yet. But for the rest of us, God says, okay, I can use you. The enemy, when he starts saying God can't, God says, no, this is when I can. But if you're saying God can use me, God said, nah, you're not ready yet. You're not ready yet. You got to be broken. You just have to. What happened when the woman brought the expensive ointment in the alabaster box? What does it say? It says, it didn't say she opened the box, it says she broke the box. And when she broke the box, it says the smell, the fragrance of this ointment just filled the house. That's what God wants to do with you. But for whatever reason, this box couldn't be opened. It could only be broken. Then what was on the inside was released out and blessed everybody in the house. You could probably take that box and stick it back together and it looked like it was whole. But once it's broken, all it takes is just the slightest touch and it opens back up again. And a person who's been truly broken, just a touch opens him back up again. Let's take some more examples. How about Israel himself? Jacob. What did his name mean? Ikav, heel, because he was grasping his brother's heel when he was born, his twin brother Esau. So they called him Heel. There's a nice name. How about naming your next son Heel? Ankle's better, but still not much. But Heel, yeah, here's my son, he's a heel. But then what happened? All these years later, all the suffering Jacob went through for the 20 years he's with his father-in-law Laban, cheated out of one bride, you know the story. And then finally he hears Esau's coming with 300 men. Esau, who swore he was going to kill him the first chance he got. So Jacob sends his family across the Jabbok River, sends his flocks across, he's left alone. And then he gets jumped in the middle of the night. He wrestles all night. Well, who is this guy he's wrestling with? It has to be Esau. There's nobody else here trying to kill me. It's got to be Esau. But when the sun comes up, he looks. This isn't Esau. It was God. And he said, let me go. Jacob says, I'm not letting you go till you bless me. And it says the angel, it's actually God's angel, God's presence. He hit him in the hip and dislocated his hip. And it says that, but he changed his name from Jacob to Yisrael, which can either mean straight to God, that's a better name than heel, isn't it? Or Prince of God, Sar-El, Prince of God. It goes from being a heel to a Prince of God. But it says, now the sun rose upon him just as he crossed over Penuel, which means the Pene, the face of El, the face of God. He called the place Peniel because I've seen God face to face, yet my life is preserved. He called it Peniel, face of God. He crossed over the face of God, but he was limping on his thigh. He was a broken man. But now he's Israel. And when he does meet Esau, they embrace. When God broke Jacob, then he was brothers again with Esau. You see the picture? And this is the name of the people of Israel. They're a broken people. Who has been through as much brokenness as this nation? Exiled to Babylon, exiled by the Romans, their city burnt, their temple destroyed, the Holocaust. No people's been broken as much as the Israeli people, and yet they're still here. God's using them. And so many blessings we enjoy in the West and around the world come out of that little tiny nation the size of New Jersey. The inventions and the technology and even the things that allow our daughter to hear, the cochlear implants invented by Jewish people. The advances in agriculture and medicine, a cure for cancer that's right there on the threshold of being released, invented by Jews in Israel. Broken, but used. And of course, Messiah, no one's ever been as broken as much as Yeshua. He wasn't exempt. Even though he was sinless, there was no resistance to God. He still let them do to him whatever they wanted. and they crucified him. Here's our example. And this is why he says, if any man will come after me, he has to deny himself, take up his cross daily and follow me. You get the idea? Whoever holds on to their life, they're going to lose it. You let go for my sake, you'll find it. It's all brokenness. It's all this picture. It's all the broken Vav. You know, Vav is the sixth letter of the alphabet. Man was made and created on the sixth day. Vav, more than the other letter, pictures a man. And Vav is the weirdest letter. It has all these different pronunciations. All the other letters have one, maybe two. Vav has about 8 or 10. It's a weird letter. It's a very fitting letter for us. It had to be broken, snapped. What else? Oh, I put down Jacob walked upright, but Israel limped. But this is the goal. Becoming Israel is the goal. And the wilderness that we all go through is God's way of turning a Jacob into an Israel. Psalm 51. You want to turn there for a minute? Psalm 51. Instead of putting the psalm on the screen, let's just look it up in our Bibles. And look at the first line. For the choir director, a psalm of David when Nathan the prophet came to him after he had come into Bathsheba. That's the setting for this psalm. What was the greatest failure in David's life? Committing adultery with Bathsheba and having her husband murdered, Uriah murdered. That's a pretty big failure. You know, earlier in the psalm, I think it's 39, he said, God, test me and see if there's any wicked way in me. Test me. I dare you, test me. God did, and boy, did David bite the dust. He failed miserably. And then Nathan comes to him to reveal to him just what a big failure David was. So what does David do? In true David form, he writes a psalm about it. He says, be gracious to me, O God, according to your loving kindness. According to the greatness of your compassion, blot out my transgressions. Now, that can sound pretty arrogant. Oh God, I'm sorry, please forgive me. Or it's a truly broken man. But a person who says, I'm a failure, I'm a washout, I'm not writing any stupid psalm, I'm just done, God's done with me, I'm useless. But a truly broken man like David, he can crawl back to God, throw himself on his face, and say, God, forgive me. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you, you only, I have sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are justified when you speak, and blameless when you judge. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me. Behold, you desire truth in the innermost being, and in the hidden part you will make me know wisdom. Purify me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Make me to hear joy and gladness. Let the bones which you have broken rejoice. Let the bones which you have broken rejoice. How can broken bones rejoice? By being healed and being stronger than they were before. Hide your face from my sins. Blot out all my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence. Do not take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your Yeshua, your salvation, and sustain me with a willing spirit. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will be converted to you. Deliver me from blood guiltiness, O God, the God of my salvation. Then my tongue will joyfully sing of your righteousness. O Lord, open my lips that my mouth may declare your praise. For you do not delight in sacrifice, otherwise I would give it. You are not pleased with burnt offering. Why does he say that? Because there's no offering for a willful sin. He had committed 2 willful sins. There's no sacrifice for that. So he says, if there's a sacrifice, I'd bring it. There is none. I'm just casting myself before you on your grace. And then he says in verse 17, the sacrifices of God are a what? A broken spirit. Do you have a broken spirit? Are you an utter failure in your life? Wonderful. Now you're a suitable sacrifice to God. Until you're a miserable failure that you are, you're not worthy of getting on his altar as a living sacrifice, but now you are. You understand? A broken and a contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. See, our problem is we do despise it. And when I've been an utter failure, a total failure, I despise my heart that got me in this trouble. But God says, now your heart's been broken. Now it's okay. That was the solution. You broke my heart plenty of times with the stupid stuff you did. But now that your heart's broken, we're on the same page. We both have broken hearts. If your heart's broken, congratulations, now you're in God's image. You're in his likeness. Then it says, by your favor do good to Zion. Build the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will delight in righteous sacrifices and burnt offering and whole burnt offering. Then young bulls will be offered on your altar. What a psalm. Let's take the temple for a moment. Israel messed up. And so God sent the prophets to say, if you don't clean up your act, I'm going to send the king of Babylon in. He's going to raid your land. He's going to take you captive. He's going to destroy your temple. They did not straighten up. Nebuchadnezzar came in, raided their land, took them captive, destroyed their temple. Their temple was left on Mount Zion, just a shell of what it was. Looked like a bomb had dropped on it. It was just an empty shell, full of dirt and weeds and wild animals just wandering through. It was no longer a temple. But 70 years later, just as God prophesied, a new king arose, and God says he'll send you back. And not all the Jews came back to Israel, but a small percentage did under the leadership of Nehemiah and Ezra. And they came and began to rebuild the wall of the city, restore the streets, and restore the temple. And when they got done restoring the temple, it didn't look all that hot. It looked pretty pathetic, and it was smaller than the original. But God sent the prophet Haggai, and instead of having a long passage, I picked out 3 verses from chapter 2, verses 3, 7, and 9. And this is what God said. Who is left among you who saw this temple in its former glory? And how do you see it now? Does it not seem to you like nothing in comparison? It's pretty beat up and haggard. I will shake all the nations, and they will come with the wealth of all nations, and I will fill this house with glory. Says Adonai of hosts. And the latter glory of this house will be greater than the former. And in this place I will give shalom. So the restored temple was smaller, didn't look nearly as polished, wasn't nearly as beautiful, but the glory was greater. Maybe that's your temple. We're temples of God's Spirit. Maybe one time you were all the razzmatazz, all the glitz and all the cleverness and the education and all the right answers, and now you just say, I'm a failure. God says, finally. Yep, you're not going to be as big as you were before. Now you're kind of old, don't have the energy. The stuffing's been knocked out of you, but the glory now is going to be amazing compared to what it was. Now you're ready to be my vessel. The Word of God is living and active and sharper than any two-edged sword. Why is it called a sword? Because it comes into our lives to slice us up. You think it's just a sword to use against the enemy. Well, I got news for you. The enemy is often you, and it needs to be put to work in your life. It'll divide your soul from your spirit. We're not to be soulish people. In 1 Corinthians, the first few chapters, Paul talks about what is the problem of being a soulish person. He wants you to be a spiritual person. Not operating on your own cleverness, but operating in his Spirit. Not operating in your own giftings, but having those put on his altar and used according to his dictates and his ways. He wants to divide the joints and the marrow. All your activities, your joints where your action takes place. But the marrow is where the blood is made that gives your joint strength, that provides the life for your joints. And then right to the thoughts and intents of your heart. He wants to slice it all open, lay it open so you can see what is what. That's painful. That's a painful surgery, but only when that is done. Now here's the interesting thing. When you read the earlier part of chapter 4, guess what he's talking about? Israelites in the wilderness. He's writing all about the Israelites in the wilderness and how they had to be broken, how they had to be devastated, and how that generation had to die so he could raise up a new one to take its place, and that leads right into this passage. It's all about brokenness. So let's go back to that word shalom with a broken vav. You see it there? Now, when something's broken, you basically usually remove it. Oh, that's broken. I had to throw out an old dehumidifier. Took it to the scrap yard yesterday. Out it goes. So let's take this vav out of the word shalom. If you throw it out, it becomes the word shalem, which means perfect. The same root. See, the word shalom comes from shalem. Peace comes from completion and perfection. So you got to break the vav. It's got to be broken. You want peace with God. And God's bringing a lot of brokenness. Seems like there's anything but peace in your life. God's at work. He's on the move. Don't let the pain be wasted. The best thing you can do is when God brings brokenness into your life, recognize that he's bringing it and just allow him to do it. I remember when our oldest son, Josh, we had to take him to the doctor. He had always got ear infections. And they had this young doctor in his probably late 20s, early 30s, big guy. Josh was maybe 2 years old. And he was thrashing around and fighting and screaming and kicking, and Robin and the doctor and me, we were all holding this little 2-year-old down so the doctor could look at his ear and try to help him. We're like Joshua too, when God's trying to bring brokenness into our lives, to bring about in our lives the thing that makes us more like him. And the more Josh fought and kicked, just the harder, more painful it was. If he just relaxed, all right, just do what you need to do. It'd been over like that. It's your resistance to God's work in your life, to the breaking he brings in your life, that causes the most pain. Breaking's always painful. And you can't reduce the pain, but you sure can make it a lot worse. We just trust him. Just trust him. So whatever you're going through, trust him. It's got a purpose. It's got a purpose. And he wants to make the latter glory of your life much greater than anything you ever imagined before. Moses knew glory as a prince of Egypt. But I tell you what, that wasn't worth squat compared to the glory he gets even today as being the leader of Israel, giving us the Torah, being God's man, God's imperfect man. What other Egyptian ruler do we talk about and read about and think about and emulate today? Just Moses, just this one broken washout. He's the one. You get the picture? I can keep going. I can give you many more examples, but I hope this should be enough that you get the picture of what the word's trying to teach. Okay? You're all so quiet. I think you all feel like me. But when I talk about these things, I'm talking about myself. And I can think of a lot of little breakings in my life, and I can think of a few major ones. And they were hell at the time. But it was a cleansing fire. I wouldn't ever want to go through any of them ever again. But wouldn't trade them for anything in the world. So let's pray. Our Father and King, all your ways are perfect. Absolutely perfect. And so many times you want to give glory to the enemy as if all of the pain in our lives is his idea. But Lord, you're God. He isn't. You're in control, not him. And you're the one who's sovereign. And you're the one who is perfect love. And so if painful things come into our lives, it's for our good. Because this life here is so short and it's over. But the things that you do in our lives here have eternal consequences, eternal reward. So, Father, forgive us for the times we resist your hand in our lives when it's unpleasant. Because we know everything you do is good, even though it's sometimes painful. So, Father, continue to work on our lives and make us the people you want us to be. And Father, we also thank you for the blessings, for the joy, for the happiness, for the abundance, for the fullness, for this, the relief of your forgiveness and of your grace in our lives, and for all the wonderful and happy and joyous things you do in our lives. But Lord, it doesn't change the fact that they're still punctuated with pain, because you're in the process of making us into your damut, into your likeness. So we thank you for that, Father. Forgive us for our resistance. But Lord, give us a heart like David, who after he was so broken and experienced such failure, he could always stand back up before you and continue to move on. This is what righteous people do. They fall, and then they get up, and they keep walking. Give us the courage to be those kind of people. Help us to be more like Yeshua. And we'll give you the glory and the praise for it all. In Yeshua's name, amen.